citadels. Had I been in my usual health I could have done the distance in an hour and a half, but I had to rest constantly, and was finally carried rather than helped up. I had gone not unwillingly, for the men were clearly by their dress Dacoits of the Deccan, and I had no doubt that it was intended either to ransom or exchange me. At the foot of this natural castle were some 20 or 30 more robbers, and I was led to a rough sort of arbour, in which was lying, on a pile of maize straw, a man who was evidently their chief. He rose, and we exchanged salams. "What is your name, Sahib?" he asked in Mahratta. "Hastings, Lieutenant Hastings," I said, "and yours?" "Sivajee Punt," he said. Now this was bad. I had fallen into the hands of the most troublesome, most ruthless, and most famous of the Dacoit leaders. Over and over again he had been hotly chased, but had always managed to get away, and when I last heard anything of what was going on, 4 or 5 troops of native police were scouring the country after him. He gave an order which I did not understand, and a wretched Bombay writer, I suppose a clerk of some money lender, was dragged forward. Sivajee Punt spoke to him for some time, and the fellow then told me in English that I was to write at once to the officer commanding the troops, telling him that I was in his hands and should be put to death directly he was attacked. "Ask him," I said, "if he will take any sum of money to let me go." Sivajee shook his head very decidedly. A piece of paper was put before me, and a pen and ink, and I wrote as I had been ordered, adding, however, in French, that I had brought myself into my present position by my own folly, and would take my chance, for I well knew the importance which government attached to Sivajee's capture. I read out loud all that I had written in English, and the interpreter translated it. Then the paper was folded, and I addressed it, "The officer commanding," and I was given some chupattis and a drink of water, and allowed to sleep. The Dacoits had apparently no fear of any immediate attack. It was still dark, although morning was just breaking, when I was awakened and was got up to the citadel. I was hoisted rather than climbed, 2 men standing above with a rope tied round my body, so that I was half hauled, half pushed up the difficult places, which would have taxed all my climbing powers had I been in health. The height of this mass of rock was about 100 feet. The top was fairly flat, with some depressions and risings, and about 80 feet long by 50 feet wide. It had evidently been used as a fortress in ages past. Along the side facing the hill were the remains of a rough wall. In the centre of a depression was a cistern some 4 feet square, lined with stonework, and in another depression a gallery had been cut, leading to a subterranean storeroom or chamber. This natural fortress rose from the face of the hill at a distance of 1,000 yards or so from the edge of the plateau, which was fully 200 feet higher than the top of the rock. In the old days it would have been impregnable, and even at that time it was an awkward place to take, for the troops were armed only with Brown Bess, and rifled cannon were not thought of. Looking round, I could see that I was some 4 miles from the point where I had descended. The camp was gone, but running my eye along the edge of the plateau, I could see the tops of tents a mile to my right, and again 2 miles to my left. Turning round and looking into the wide valley, I saw a regimental camp. It was evident that a vigorous effort was being made to surround and capture the Dacoits, since troops had been brought up from Bombay. In addition to the troops above and below, there would probably be a strong police force acting on the face of the hill. I did not see all these things at the time, for I was, as soon as I got to the top, ordered to sit down behind the parapet, a fellow armed to the teeth squatting down by me, and signifying that if I showed my head above the stones he would cut my throat without hesitation. There were, however, sufficient gaps between the stones to allow me to have a view of the crest of the gap, while below my view extended down to the hills behind Bombay. It was evident to me now why the Dacoits did not climb up into the fortress. There were dozens of similar crags on the face of the Ghauts, and the troops did not as yet know their whereabouts. It was a sort of blockade of the whole face of the hills which was being kept up, and there were probably enough several bands of Dacoits lurking in the jungle. There were only 2 guards and myself on the rock plateau. I discussed with myself the chances of my overpowering them and holding the top of the rock till help came, but I was greatly weakened and not a match for a boy, much less for the 2 stalwart Mahrattas. Besides, I was by no means sure that the way I had been brought up was the only possible path to the top. The day passed off quietly. The heat on the bare rock was frightful, but one of the men, seeing how weak and ill I really was, fetched a thick rug from the storehouse, and with the aid of a stick made a sort of lean-to against the wall, under which I lay sheltered from the sun. Once or twice during the day I heard a few distant musket shots, and once a sharp, heavy outburst of firing. It must have been 3 or 4 miles away, but it was on the side of the Ghaut, and showed that the troops or police were at work. My guards looked anxiously in that direction, and uttered sundry curses. When it was dark, Sivajee and 8 of the Dacoits came up. From what they said, I gathered that the rest of the band had dispersed, trusting either to get through the line of their pursuers, or, if caught, to escape with slight punishment, the men who remained being too deeply concerned in murderous outrages to hope for mercy. Sivajee himself handed me a letter, which the man who had taken my note had brought back in reply. Major Knapp, the writer, who was the second in command, said that he could not engage the government, but that if Lieutenant Hastings was given up, the act would certainly dispose the government to take the most merciful view possible, but that if, on the contrary, any harm was suffered by Lieutenant Hastings, every man taken would be at once hung. Sivajee did not appear put out about it. I did not think he expected any other answer, and imagined that his real object in writing was simply to let them know that I was a prisoner, and so enable him the better to paralyze the attack upon a position which he no doubt considered all but impregnable. I was given food, and was then allowed to walk as I chose upon the little plateau, 2 of the Dacoits taking post as sentries at the steepest part of the path, while the rest gathered, chatting and smoking, in the depression in front of the storehouse. It was still light enough for me to see for some distance down the face of the rock, and I strained my eyes to see if I could discern any other spot at which an ascent or descent was possible. The prospect was not encouraging. At some places the face fell sheer away from the edge, and so evident was the impracticability of escape that the only place which I glanced at twice was the western side, which is the one away from the hill. Here it sloped gradually for a few feet. I took off my shoes and went down to the edge. Below, some 10 feet, was a ledge, on to which with care I could get down, but below that was a sheer fall of some 50 feet. As a means of escape it was hopeless, but it struck me that if an attack was made I might slip away and get on to the ledge. Once there I could not be seen except by a person standing where I now was, just on the edge of the slope, a spot to which it was very unlikely that anyone would come. The thought gave me a shadow of hope, and, returning to the upper end of the platform, I lay down, and in spite of the hardness of the rock was soon asleep. The pain of my aching bones woke me up several times, and once, just as the first tinge of dawn was coming, I thought I could hear movements in the jungle. I raised myself somewhat, and I saw that the sounds had been heard by the Dacoits, for they were standing listening, and some of them were bringing spare firearms from the storehouse in evident preparation for attack. As I afterwards learned, the police had caught one of the Dacoits trying to effect his escape, and by means of a little of the ingenious torture to which the Indian police then frequently resorted, when their white officers were absent, they obtained from him the exact position of Sivajee's band, and learned the side from which the ascent must be made. That the Dacoit and his band were still upon the slopes of the Ghauts they knew, and were gradually narrowing the circle, but there were so many rocks and hiding places that the process of searching was a slow one, and the intelligence was so important that the news was off at once to the colonel, who gave orders for the police to surround the rock at daylight, and to storm it if possible. The garrison was so small that the police were alone ample for the work, supposing that the natural difficulties were not altogether insuperable. Just at daybreak there was a distant noise of men moving in the jungle, and the Dacoit halfway down the path fired his gun.